Welcome to our session, our ninth session on Daniel. We are in Daniel chapter 5 and verse 10. Let's read Daniel 5:10 through 12. The queen entered the banquet hall because of the words of the king and his nobles. The queen spoke and said, "O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts alarm you or your face be pale. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods, and in the days of your father illumination, insight, and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar your father the king, appointed him chief of the magicians, conjurers, Chaldeans, and diviners. This was because an extraordinary spirit, knowledge, and insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of enigmas, and solving of difficult problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Let Daniel now be summoned, and he will declare the interpretation." This queen that is mentioned here is probably Nebuchadnezzar's wife, which would make her possibly the queen mother. There's no definite that's not definite, but it's possible this is the queen mother because she has to be. I mean, the likelihood is that she is an older woman. Not the wife of Belshazzar, which would be his age or younger, but probably an older woman because she remembers the fact that Daniel is in the kingdom. Why does Belshazzar not know Daniel? Well, it could be that Daniel has retired by this time. It could be that he has moved from center stage, so to speak, because he was an advisor to Nebuchadnezzar. Excuse me. And it could be that he is, when the new king or several kings, like we've said, have come between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, and therefore it could be that administrations change, etc., etc. But Daniel is still remembered by what we suppose to be the Queen Mother, and she is recommending that he be called. Her idea is that if he did it before, if he did this type of thing before and was made master of the magicians or conjurers, Chaldeans, and diviners, then he can accomplish this again. Now let's read verse 13 through 16. Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Are you that Daniel who is one of the exiles from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? Now I've heard about you that a spirit of the gods is in you, and the illumination, and that illumination, insight, and extraordinary wisdom have been found in you. Just now the wise men and the conjurers were brought in before me that they might read this inscription and make its interpretation known to me, but they could not declare the interpretation of the message. But I personally have heard about you, that you are able to give interpretations and solve difficult problems. Now if you are able to read the inscription and make its interpretation known to me, you will be clothed with purple and wear a necklace of gold around your neck, and you will have authority as the third ruler in the kingdom." again, why does it seem that Belshazzar does not know Daniel? Well, as we said, his public work in association with the government may have long ended before this time. We also got to keep in mind that Daniel is probably around 80 years old at this point. Maybe even, I would say, probably close to 85 or 90, depending on how old he was when when the people went into captivity. He's told no one else can read this, but we understand that you can. So now let's read 17 through 24. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, keep your gifts for yourself, or give your rewards to someone else. However, I will read the inscription to the king and make the interpretation known to him. O king, the Most High God granted sovereignty, grandeur, glory, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar your father. Because of the grandeur which he bestowed on him, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language feared and trembled before him. Whomever he wished he killed, and whomever he wished he spared alive, and whomever he wished he elevated, and whomever he wished he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit became so proud that he behaved arrogantly, he was deposed from his royal throne, and his glory was taken away from him. He was also driven away from mankind, and his heart was made like that of beasts, and his dwelling place was with the wild donkeys. He was given grass to eat like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he recognized that the Most High God is ruler over the realm of mankind, and that he sets over it whomever he wishes. Yet you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this. But you have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your nobles, your wives and your concubines, have been drinking wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see, hear, or understand. But the God in whose hand are your life breath and all your ways, you have not glorified. Now, we see something wonderful about the character of Daniel in verse 17. He's not in this for the money or worldly gain. He's not in this to gain prestige or power or authority. He would speak God's truth, but it would not be because he sought man's rewards for it. In addition, he would teach the truth, regardless of who the listener might be. He had the courage to say what needed to be said to the king, just like he would to the common people if he had the chance, we are sure. But remember back in chapter 4, where Daniel begged the king, Nebuchadnezzar, to turn from his wicked ways. He now is basically saying to Belshazzar, you knew what happened to Nebuchadnezzar, and you did not learn from it. You are stubborn, you're proud, and the God of heaven is going to bring his judgment upon you. Not only was he a proud man, but he had used the holy vessels of the temple for a drunken feast. He had praised idols that cannot see, hear, or know anything. And Daniel points out that his life was in the hand of God. Note that, again, Belshazzar was well aware of what had transpired in the land, in the life of his grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar. He was certainly well aware of why the king's troubles came to him and the king's final praise of Jehovah. And as Buster Dobbs points out Belshazzar knew all this. He knew it, but he blocked it out of his mind. He knew it, and he still defiled sacred vessels and praised the gods of this world. He knew it, but wallowed in filth. He knew it, but carried himself in intolerable pride. So a good summation of what Belshazzar was doing. Now let's go on and read verses 25 to 29. Now this is the inscription that was written out: Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. This is the interpretation of the message. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found deficient. And Perez, your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and Persians. Then Belshazzar gave orders, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a necklace of gold around his neck, and issued a proclamation concerning him that he now had authority as the third ruler in the kingdom. Basically, God told told Belshazzar that his time as king has ended. And God is the one who is behind his end. God has seen his actions, and he does not like what he sees. He has been weighed in the balances and found wanting. And the kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Sorry. My computer just did some things that got to get back to where I was. Okay. Now, in chapter 8 and verse 20, we're going to see where Daniel, even though, as we said earlier, the chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8 are out of chronological order. So chapters 7 and 8 come before chapters 5 and 6. And we will see when we get to chapter 8 that Daniel has already, in the third year of Belshazzar's reign, predicted the overthrow of the Babylonian kingdom by the Medes and the Persians. This is something, even though we haven't covered it yet, has already happened in history prior to the events of chapter 5. Now, Daniel's motive, as we said earlier, his motive in interpreting the message written on the wall was not to receive material blessings and earthly authority. However, when these were given to him, he accepted them. Note that, as we will see in the next chapter, Daniel's high authority continues under the Medo-Persian rule, the Medo-Persian Empire. Excuse me again. Now let's look at chapter 5, verses 30 and 31. That same night, Belshazzar the Chaldean king was slain, so Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. Again, we remember that Jeremiah had predicted the fall of Babylon back in Jeremiah chapters 51 and 52. Daniel records the death of Babylon's ruler and the kingdom's takeover in just 2 verses. Hold on just a second. Okay, now what we need to understand about these verses, first and foremost, is the idea that in verse 31, Darius the Mede receives the kingdom. Actually, Cyrus is the first king. He's generally recognized as the first king in the Medo-Persian Empire. But in this verse, Darius the Mede is given credit for receiving the kingdom. Basically, what's going on here is he is simply being credited with taking Babylon. As Smith has pointed out, he puts it this way. He says, seemingly an advance guard of the troops of Cyrus under the command of one Darius the Mede came that night upon Babylon, and in the midst of the great drunken feast entered it without battle, and raced to the palace where Belshazzar was slain. Cyrus soon came to Babylon, but gave control to Darius the Mede for a brief time. Belshazzar's father, Nabonidus, was taken at Borsippa, and thus fell the empire of Babylon little more than 20 years after the height of its splendor under Nebuchadnezzar. So there's really, people will point to chapter 5 and chapter 6, and they will look for a mistake here, that Cyrus was king. Why is Darius being recorded here as taking the kingdom? But basically he is the commanding general and is given control over Babylon by Cyrus. He's commanding general and is the first one to take Babylon, but then later is given control of Babylon by Cyrus. Now, history also records history also records the name Gubaru. Darius seems to be the same person as this Gubaru, who, according to Persian inscriptions, was an officer in Cyrus's army. And as we've said, he seems to have been made governor of the Persian province north of Babylon. Darius's rule seems to have been contemporary with Cyrus's rule, and the 2 years of Darius are included in the 9 years which are assigned to Cyrus in the Babylonian annals, or the Babylonian history, as his real position was known to the scribes, while the close relations of Darius with the captive Jews account for their speaking of him as the king and dating the year of his death as the first year of Cyrus. This was the glorious year of their own restoration to their land. This is all according to Smith, page 707. As we end this chapter, do you think maybe that Belshazzar and his guests imagined that their kingdom would fall? The fact is that evidently Belshazzar had no clue that the kingdom's end and his own end would come about that very night. The point we're trying to make here is that we don't know the future, and the fact is that Jesus uses this type of situation to speak of his own second coming, the judgment day, in the fact that we don't know when that will be. We don't know when that's going to occur. It could happen any moment. It could happen on any day. We're not guaranteed the next second, much less the next hour, the next day, the next week, or the next month or year. Jesus said that his second coming in the judgment day would be as in the days of Noah. People were marrying, given in marriage, and they did not know. Even though Noah preached for about 120 years, saying there's a flood coming, they ignored it. They didn't care. They didn't believe him. And therefore they perished. So we should always be on the alert to keep our lives in such a way as to be ready for the second coming of Christ, no matter when it happens. All right, this brings us to chapter 6. In this chapter we have another very famous Bible story, Bible account, in the fact of Daniel being cast into the lion's den. Let's read verses 1 through 3. It seemed good to appoint 100. It seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, that they would be in charge of the whole kingdom, and over them 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one, and that these satraps might be accountable to them, and that the king might not suffer loss. Then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. Now the date for this event, or this set of events, is 538 BC. Excuse me. Again, although Darius is identified as king, he was under the rule of Cyrus, and most likely served more as an administrator of the affairs of Babylon shortly after it fell to the Medes and Persians. The managing or ruling arrangement of Darius was to place 120 officials. Some translations call them princes, some translations call them satraps. 120 officials over the kingdom. And then over these 120 he placed 3 presidents or governors, or as the New American Standard says, commissioners. And because of Daniel's excellent spirit, conduct, and efficiency, the king thought about, or considered, planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. I guess you could say as chief commissioner. Daniel had truly distinguished himself above his co-workers. Now, remember that Daniel had been ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and he had been chief of the governors over all the wise men of Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar. And then finally he had been made 3rd ruler in the kingdom of Babylon at the time that it fell. Therefore it was nothing new for Daniel to find favor in the sight of the ruling civil authorities, and Daniel has great experience with administrative duties. Now we come to chapter 6. Let's read verses 4 through 9. Then the commissioners and satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs, but they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. Then these men said, we will not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God. Then these commissioners and satraps came by agreement to the king and spoke to him as follows. King Darius lived forever. All the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the high officials and the governors, have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it may not be changed, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked. Therefore King Darius signed the document, that is, the injunction. Well, the other commissioners are jealous of Daniel, and they want to bring him down. They don't want to be under him, they don't want him to be their boss, and they want to get rid of him. Now, why would these men be so dead set against Daniel? Well, it's possibly because he was a Jew. If you'll read the book of Esther, under the time of the Persian Empire, when the Persians ruled without the Medes, Xerxes is swayed by a man by the name of Haman to to destroy the Jews. So there was a great hatred for Jews on the part of some, and we see that carries down through time. The most famous illustration of that, or example of that, is obviously the Holocaust under the Nazis, Hitler. But this may be the reason why they want to get rid of Daniel, or maybe they're simply jealous. We don't know. However, when they tried to find some fault or error in Daniel, they couldn't find any. That is, he was blameless. There was nothing in him that was wrong. He didn't take bribes, and he didn't mismanage what was under his control. He had a wonderful character, and that in and of itself may be another reason, or the reason why why these men want to do away with him, because Daniel is better than them in his actions and in the way he conducts himself, and the fact is that whenever anyone in this world acts the way they ought to act, does the things they ought to do, there's going to be somebody or some group of people who want to tear them down and bring them down to the level that they themselves are on. The idea of if you are doing what you're supposed to do, if you're acting right, by the way you're acting, you are implicitly condemning other people's actions. You may not be intending that, but the fact is that if you live a pure and righteous life, then by your own life, other people looking at it and seeing it, you are condemning what they are doing if they are not doing righteous deeds and having a pure life themselves. But not only does Daniel display this great character, he displays it even after so many years, and in a place that is far, far from home. You know, it has happened in the past that men or women have lived most of their life in service to God, And then before the end comes, before the end of their life occurs, at some point they just get tired and they give up. Well, Daniel didn't do that. Again, he's probably 80, 85, 90 years old, and he's still serving God. So Daniel was well known for his righteousness. Another point to observe is this. Daniel, despite his outstanding conduct and excellent spirit and faithfulness to Jehovah, he had enemies. He had opponents. He had people who, as we said, wanted to tear him down, wanted to bring him down to their level. So what does that show us? No matter what you do, no matter how faithful you are, there's going to be somebody in this world who's going to be against you. Either somebody or some group of people. And you just might as well go ahead and expect it. What was it that Paul said? Those who live godly will suffer persecution. There's going to be people out there who don't like you for whatever reason. No matter if you're the kindest, most righteous, faithful person that has ever lived, there's going to be somebody against you. And you might as well prepare for it. Don't get too discouraged by it. I know it can be discouraging, but don't be too discouraged by it, and don't give in to to that treatment, especially if you've done nothing wrong to deserve it. Don't give in to that. All right. Finally, Daniel's adversaries realized that the only way for them to get to Daniel was to somehow use the law of God and Daniel's faithfulness to that law to catch him in what they would describe as wrongdoing. Now, the actual decree that the king approved or put into law is recorded in verse 7. It included punishment for anyone that did not obey it. And that punishment was to be cast into the den of lions. Now, it appears that the king had no idea what the motive was behind this special request, because we will see later on that he will be very concerned about Daniel. But one thing that might be involved here is a little bit of pride on the part of Darius. That his pride might have got the best of him in this instance. Now, this law, no prayer or petition could be made to anyone except the king for 30 days. This law will be a case of man's law clashing with the law of Jehovah. And the question is, how will God's people respond on this occasion? Daniel is the only one that we are given as to how he responded. But we know that if Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have remained faithful, they too would have refused, along with others. But probably the reason that they are not brought into the picture here is probably one of two things, maybe more. But it could be that they themselves are dead by this time. Or it could be that since these other administrators are only concerned with Daniel, he's the only one that they are worried about charging with breaking this law. So either one of these could be true. Now, one amazing aspect of the law of the Medes and the Persians was that it could not be changed. Now, we saw this when we discussed the kingdom. We said that the Babylonians provided certain things for the coming of God's kingdom, that is, the establishment of the synagogue. The Medes and the Persians provided an unchangeable law, or the idea of unchangeable law. The Greeks provided a language, Koine Greek, and the Romans provided the peace of Rome, fairly decent protection from criminals and so forth, and also very good roads that the gospel might travel far and quickly. So here we have the Medes and the Persians and their unchangeable law. That is, once a law was on the books, so to speak, in the Persian kingdom, it could not be changed or repealed. Again, a good example of that is the law that Xerxes, or Artaxerxes, I forget which one was king at the time, the law that was made during the time of Esther, that all Jews were to be destroyed. And the king could not undo that. He could not change that. But what he could do was make another law which stated that the Jews could protect themselves, could defend themselves. So the law of the Medes and the Persians could not be changed. Now let's turn to verses 10 through 17. Now when Daniel knew, we might say when Daniel heard, when Daniel found out that the document was signed, he entered his house. Now in his roof chamber he had windows open toward Jerusalem, and he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. And these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and supplication before his God. Then they approached and spoke before the king about the king's injunction. Did you not sign an injunction that any man who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days is to be cast into the lion's den? The king replied, the statement is true, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which may not be revoked. Then they answered and spoke before the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the injunction which you signed, but keeps making his petition 3 times a day. Then as soon as the king heard this statement, he was deeply distressed and set his mind on delivering Daniel, and even until sunset he kept exerting himself to rescue him. And these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, recognize, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians that no injunction or statute which the king establishes may be changed. Then the king gave orders, and Daniel was brought in and cast into the lion's den. The king spoke and said to Daniel, your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you. The stone was brought and laid over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing would be changed in regard to Daniel. Then the king went off to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no entertainment was brought before him, and his sleep fled from him. Now, Daniel is cast into the lion's den because he disobeys the king's law. And even though Daniel knew that what the new law stated, he continued to pray 3 times each day. This demonstrated his faith and his courage. He wasn't showing off. He wasn't making a show of his faith. He was simply being faithful. He was being steadfast in his faith. And it was not uncommon for the Jews to pray or worship toward Jerusalem, where the temple stood, possibly understanding that God, as we might figuratively put it, God's temple, Therefore, his dwelling place is there. Now, other passages of Scripture state very clearly that no temple, no building, no anything could hold God. But he chose, as he said, to put his name in Jerusalem, to dwell with his people, among his people, in the most holy place of the temple. So praying toward or worshiping toward Jerusalem became common on the part of the exiles. Now, we notice Daniel's disregard for the king's decree, and this is just what the other administrators were counting on. Verse 11. And note how the adversaries of Daniel presented his so-called crime to the king. They reminded the king that Daniel was a Jewish captive. They portrayed Daniel as having no respect for the king or his law. And they pointed out that Daniel did not just violate the king's law once, but he did it 3 times every day. You know, it's interesting that when someone wants a negative slant put on things, they can do it very well. And that's what these men did. Well, the king was greatly saddened to hear of the dilemma that both he and Daniel were in. Excuse me, the king was displeased with himself, and he wanted to find some way to spare Daniel. But he could not, because, again, the law of the Medes and Persians could not be changed. Note what the king confessed as they cast Daniel into the lion's den. He understood and acknowledged that Daniel served God continually. Now, what does that tell us about Daniel's example? He didn't just, evidently, he didn't go through life simply living life, acting right, but never saying anything about his faith, never saying anything about God. He obviously said some things. He obviously did some things. He lived his life in faithfulness to God. But I think it's pretty obvious that he must have said something about Jehovah God. And the king knew this. The king knew of his faith. And therefore Daniel's example and his demeanor and his speech, his actions are not only in line with what God said they should be, but also he evidently is somewhat outspoken. That's my opinion on what's going on here. The king evidently knew something about Daniel's God, because he says that Daniel's God would deliver him. Now, can you picture the situation in your mind? This is something we've already noted, but let's note it again. Daniel is somewhere between 80 and 90 years old. He's still faithful to God. He's still a man of prayer. And this elderly man is tossed in with wild animals to be slaughtered. And I would surmise that the thoughts that are going through Daniel's head are similar to what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said back in chapter 3. And that is, if my God chooses to deliver me, He can. But if He does not, then that's fine. Again, nothing is said in the text about that, but I can just imagine Daniel thinking those types of things. Well, now let's read. Excuse me. Don't know what's wrong with me today. Let's read verses 18 through 23. Then the king, I'm sorry, we've already read verse 18. Let's read 19 through 23. Then the king arose at dawn at the break of day and went in haste to the lion's den. When he had come near to the den to Daniel, he cried out with a troubled voice. The king spoke and said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions? Daniel spoke to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, inasmuch as I was found innocent before him, and also toward you, O king, I have committed no crime. Then the king was very pleased and gave orders for Daniel to be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. The king then gave orders, and they brought those men who had maliciously accused Daniel, and they cast them, their children, and their wives into the lion's den, and they had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. So, I read verse 24 when I wasn't supposed to, but that's okay. What do we learn from the king's question that is recorded in verse 20? Well, again, we understand that at the very least, Daniel is one who is outspoken about his God, Jehovah God, and his life is one of constant service to God, and the king recognizes that. How can we explain the fact that Daniel went unharmed in the lion's den? Well, as Daniel says, my God has sent his angel and has shut the lions' mouths that they have not hurt me. Now, why would Jehovah protect Daniel? Well, in verse 22 and 23, it's because Daniel was found to be innocent before God and the king. And verse 23, because he believed in his God. Now let's read verses 25 to 28. I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and enduring forever. And his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. And his kingdom will be forever. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel, enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Now, Daniel's accusers and adversaries and their families were killed by the same lions that had not bothered Daniel. This plainly shows that there's only one explanation as to why Daniel got out of the lion's den alive. And that is, as he said, God delivered him. Now, if you go back to chapter 3, again, the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, the same fire that did not harm Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego killed the men who were tasked with throwing them into the fire. So basically the same idea happens here. It's just this time the accusers of Daniel are the ones who are thrown in. Now, King Darius then passed a decree for all people in his kingdom to tremble and fear before Jehovah God. what did Darius say about Daniel's God? He said, He is living, steadfast forever, has everlasting dominion and kingdom, delivers and rescues, works signs and wonders. So, in some ways, this statement is similar to what Nebuchadnezzar stated back in chapter 4, I guess it was. The end of chapter 3 and the beginning of chapter 4. And again, while we said in chapter 4 that Nebuchadnezzar, if he converted to following Jehovah, that would have been the time that I would recognize as his doing so. I don't feel as strongly about Darius here in his statements, because notice that he does not say my God. He says Daniel's God. He describes the God. He describes in verse 26, I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom, men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. I don't think that Cyrus has become a believer. Now, while Darius's intentions may have been good, let's look at this from another angle. While Darius's intentions may have been good, no civil leader, no political leader has the authority to order or force people to worship Jehovah God. Remember that. No civil leader, no political leader has the right to force or order people to serve Jehovah God, to worship Him. So Darius oversteps his bounds here. Finally, on chapter 6, notice that Cyrus continued to reign until around 529 BC, and Daniel was still prophesying at least into the 3rd year of Cyrus's reign, and we'll see that in chapter 10 and verse 1. So we have the end then of Daniel's narrative section of his book. Chapters 1 through 6 have to do with historical narratives. Regular language, so to speak. But in chapter 7 and following, in chapters 7 through 12, we will be dealing with, as we've called it before, apocalyptic language. And apocalyptic language is basically figurative language, which is meant to convey a certain meaning to the readers. People who would read this book would be able to understand certain things about their historical setting. That is, the events that are occurring, that are described here in chapter 7 through 12 will be things that will come to pass later on. And as people look back to the book of Daniel and they understand the visions and so forth that Daniel receives, they will understand the events of that time that come after the prophecies of Daniel. Alright, let's do a kind of a breakdown of chapter 7. There are 3 visions in this chapter, with a section on interpretation of the visions. The first vision includes 4 great beasts coming up out of the sea. Daniel 7 verses 1 through 8. The second vision concerns the Ancient of Days sitting on his throne. Chapter 7 verses 9 through 12. And the third vision is the Son of Man coming to the Ancient of Days to receive a kingdom. This will be verses 13 and 14 of Daniel chapter 7. Now, the last part of chapter 7, about 14 verses 15 through 28, again deals with the interpretation of the visions that Daniel saw. All right, let's start chapter 7 by reading verse 1. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions in his mind as he lay on his bed. Then he wrote the dream down and related the following summary of it. Now, Belshazzar is, as we saw, first mentioned in Daniel chapter 5, verse 1. But as we noted, Daniel chapter 7 is historically, chronologically before Daniel chapter 5 in terms of chronological order. And this must be the case because the events recorded in Daniel 5 took place in the period of one night, the night that Belshazzar died. Next, notice that, as we have noted before, Belshazzar co-reigned with his father Nabonidus. It is believed that the first year of Belshazzar was the third year of Nabonidus' reign, which was 555 to 538 BC. So the third year of his reign would probably be 552. That is when Belshazzar became co-regent with his father. Now, this is the first time in the book of Daniel that we read of Daniel himself having a dream and visions. Okay? Prior to this, the dreams or visions have been those that others have had, and that which Daniel interpreted for them. And the visions that Daniel saw involved great world empires and the kingdom of the Messiah. Well, let's go ahead and read verses 2 and 3. Daniel said, I was looking in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and 4 beasts were coming up from the sea, different from one another. Now, what do these 4 great beasts symbolize? Well, according to verse 17, we're going to see that they symbolize 4 kings. Verse 23 is going to make it plain that the 4 kings had reference to 4 kingdoms. Thus, the 4 great beasts symbolize 4 great kingdoms. The vision of the 4 great beasts is a parallel to Nebuchadnezzar's vision of the image that had 4 different parts identified in chapter 2. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a second. The vision of the 4 great beasts is parallel to Nebuchadnezzar's vision of the image that had 4 different parts identified back in chapter 2. In both cases, 4 kingdoms are noted, and the imagery is different. In chapter 2, it was 1 great image, while in chapter 7, it is 4 great beasts. But the basic idea is the same: 4 powerful kingdoms. All right, that brings us to Daniel 7, verse 3. We'll pick up with chapter 7, verses 4 through 8 in session 10. Thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, let me know.